Our first reading today is from 1 John chapter 3. This is the message you have heard from the beginning. We should love one another. We know what real love is because Jesus gave up his life for us. So we also ought to give up our lives for our brothers and sisters. If someone has enough money to live well and sees a brother or sister in need, but shows no compassion, how can God's love be in that person? Dear children, let's not merely say that we love each other. Let us show the truth by our actions. And the second reading is from Luke chapter 10. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus replied, What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it? The man answered, You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Right, Jesus told him. Do this and you will live. The man wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but also passed on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan smoothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, Take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked. The man replied, The one who showed him mercy. Then Jesus said, Yes, now go and do the same. Here ends the reading.
So I have to say thank you to Jim and to Casey, which many of you don't know yet, but she's sitting over here in this area. And I just want to say thank you to them because of what they said last night at the fundraiser for, okay, all I can think of is Love Made Claim, and that's not the right name. Light of Love. Yes, okay, Light of Love. It is the mission that Natasha, our drummer, is attached to, and because of what Jim said at their event last night and what Casey said, I went home and I had to rewrite my whole sermon. So, I know, I wondered if you would. Linda's going, she did, she really did. So thank you for a short night. But as we start our Lenten journey this week, we came on Ash Wednesday acknowledging our need for Jesus. That the words that we say with the ashes on our forehead is from dust we are and to dust we will return. But for now, we are beloved dust that God breathes life into. And in order to experience that life that God is continuously breathing into us, we have to stop long enough to breathe in, right? And so during Lent, we are having times of oasis, which, as we've talked about in the past few weeks, These times are at different times throughout the weeks and in different forms. And today's, Wednesday's Oasis was here, and the stations that are around in the church, and we were asked to leave them up. And so we're going to. And so if you didn't get a chance to be here on Ash Wednesday, I invite you to come and participate in any of the stations as you feel led. But also, as we began this time, or then I guess we're going to, okay, well, this is what happens when I rewrite my sermon on Saturday night, right? But today, so for this week, the Oasis is today at the Second Sunday Social. And we're going to eat together, and we're going to actually talk to each other and talk about community and how that keeps us grounded in the love of Jesus. And so encourage you all to come to Second Sunday Social. And then you're also going to receive today as you go out, or when you want to pick up, there's a sheet that says service. It's entitled Service Projects that you can do during spring break. And we know for many of you, you travel during spring break, and some of you don't, and that's okay. But it's ideas of how to incorporate service into how you live your daily life. So things like if you're traveling, make eye contact with the flight staff and say hi and thank you and be polite. Or over-tip a wait staff and if you have children, let them tell the wait staff why you are tipping them more. Things like that. They're simple, they're easy, and you can create your own. Grab one of the sheets before you leave, because there's no physical here Oasis, not this week, but next week. So all these things are to help us take moments to breathe in the life that God is trying to breathe into us. And then also grounding us in ways to stay connected. So also then during Lent, the story of Lent is the messy middle, right? Like Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem to die and rise again, but he's not there yet. And along the way, he's telling stories, but people aren't getting it. Not that doesn't ever happen today. And then eventually Jesus leads a parade, but it is not the kind of parade that the people were expecting the Messiah to lead in, right? And so Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and he's living in this messy middle, and we are too, right? Because we live in the time after Jesus came and before Jesus returns. And this, my friends, is the messy middle. Life is not black or white or red or blue or true or false or right or wrong. It's not that distinct. It's not distinctly this or that. Yet we all feel the pressure and the tension to choose a side, right? Faith is way more complex than a side. And that's where we're going to reside during Lent here. In the complexity, in the beauty, in the multicolored, messy middle. Each week, we're going to get the chance to consider how Jesus redefines, upends labels and definitions. And some of those are things we still cling so hard to. Like, for example, if you were here on Wednesday, we talked about intentions. We intend to do something, and action. And actually, those two things aren't that far apart when you put them together and intentionally act. So that's just an example of how we're going to look at things that seem polar opposites. Where do we find ourselves in the middle? And so today's story starts us off. I find it interesting that this story starts and ends with the same question: who is my neighbor? Now, I think we can all spit out, if I asked you, I'm sure you could, spit out all kinds of labels that we put on each other, and divisions that we make, and definitions that we have written about each other and the other, right? We can, even within our community here, there are young families and there are olders, and there are empty nesters, and there are high school and middle school and littles, and there are some of us who are more traditional and some of us that are more on the edge. And even when there aren't high barriers to each other, we as people are really good at creating barriers, right? And we create those barriers, and then we decide that we don't want to have anything to do with them. Whoever them is. We decide, I don't want to have anything to do with them, right? But friends, Jesus calls us to be community in the middle with. As Jim put it last night, to be love for the other. This is what it means to love your neighbor and the stranger. To be love that shows up for, not asking from, but being for. Now, I'm going to come back to that, hang on to that, but I want to go back to our story for a minute. For many of us, this is a familiar story, right? This Jewish man is going is going down the road to Jericho, and he gets beat up, and his money is stolen, and he's left to die. And then there's these holy people that come by and ignore him, and then there's this person that comes by. The least likely person comes by and helps, right? But before we get to that story even, this story starts with an expert in religious law. Okay, that's like a long biblical term for a lawyer. Okay? So his question, I wonder if it's a real question or if he is trying to catch Jesus in some kind of, breaking of religious law. But his question is actually a challenge to Jesus. Does Jesus know the law? And in true Jesus form, he doesn't answer. He asks another question, right? And basically what he's saying to the lawyer is, do you know the law? And so the lawyer, I guess, be this right or wrong, I always see him saying this a little self-righteously. Well, of course, the law says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus is like, great! Like, you listened to the sermons. You got it, right? Now go and do it. But that's not really what the lawyer was asking. So he takes it another step and he goes, well, so Jesus, who's my neighbor? We cannot, I don't think today, begin to understand the absolute shock the audience who heard this story felt when Jesus told it. Samaritans were to be avoided at all costs. Jewish people would literally add days to their journey so they could go around Samaria instead of going through it. And Samaritans and Jews, it's not like they're people who came from opposite ends of the world. They were at one time one people. And then they had, an argument over the carpet, basically. I mean, they argued about what was the real mountain to worship God on. And that went all the way to the point where you did not have any contact. If you were a good Jewish person, you did not have any contact with anybody who was a Samaritan. And so we often hear this story As a story, it's just a good story, right? That happened to somebody else. But today, I want you to put yourself in this story. And you are not the Samaritan, and you are not the priest, and you are not the Levite. You're not even the lawyer. You are the man lying on the side of the road. Who would be the last person you would want to show up for you? Who would be the last person in the world you would want them to show up for you? Now, who's walking by? Now, we think poorly often of the Levite and the priest. In the translation we read, the temple worker, right? But know this. If they had stopped, they would have been made unclean because they would have had contact with blood and some other things. So they if they had helped, they wouldn't be able to do the job that they were called and being paid to do until they had gone through days, sometimes weeks, of cleanliness rituals. Now we think that's kind of crazy and, well, that shouldn't be a reason to stop. But what stops us from helping? Sometimes it's not any crazier than that, right? But they were thinking about what they had been called to do. So maybe they didn't stop because they were afraid of being unclean. Maybe they didn't stop because they were afraid that whoever was still around that had beat up this guy was still lurking, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul, right? Do you want to get robbed? I don't. And so maybe they walked on because they were afraid. Whatever their reasoning, it is easier to choose, or it was easier for them to close their eyes and their hearts to the one, to you, lying on the road. One who would call them to something more than average every day. And then this Samaritan comes along. The least likely person comes along. He is despised by this hurt man, by this person laying on the ground, without ever being known by him. The last person in the world who would be thought to be helpful. Who is that person in your mind? Imagine they showed up and helped. Because that is what happened. The Samaritan takes the question that the priest and the Levite, the temple worker, asked, what will happen if I stop? And flips it upside down and says, what will happen to this person if I don't stop? We can say it another way. We can say the Levite and the priest ask themselves, what will helping take from me? And the Samaritan asks, how can I be for this person? We talk around here all the time about being, say it with me, the hands, feet, and voice of Jesus. Yes. We talk about it all the time. And when we say that, what we're actually saying is that we want to be who Jesus is. We want to do what Jesus would do. And the love of Jesus is not, what can I get from someone? The love of Jesus is always, what can I do for someone? Love doesn't take from. Love shows up for. So how do we show up for? I want to suggest 3 ways this morning. First of all, with the Samaritan, he did not see a stranger. He saw a fellow traveler on the journey who needed to know what love was for them. And so the Samaritan showed up. So we show up being for the other person. How can I be Jesus' love for them? And then, 2, love shows up with vulnerability. And you go, well, the Samaritan wasn't vulnerable or anything. You know, he had strength, and he clearly had money. He paid the hotel and all of that. But the Samaritan stopped on a very dangerous road. The Samaritan shows risky mercy. Because not only is he on a dangerous road, but this is a person who despises him. And he shows up anyway. The humanity of the priest and the Levite, like they were vulnerable to the pressures of society or to their roles, right? We're vulnerable in those ways too. When some voice in our head says, don't stop, don't stop, don't stop, don't stop. Don't care, don't care, don't care, don't care, right? And then there's the vulnerability of the innkeeper. Like, the innkeeper doesn't really get, he just gets a byline in the story. But 2 strangers show up at his hotel. One is in pretty bad condition, and the other one says, here's a little bit of money to take care of him. If it costs you more, he's already assuming that the innkeeper is going to take care of the man, right? If it costs you more, when I come back by, I'll settle with you. The innkeeper trusts, right? We don't know that he knew the Samaritan. He just trusts that what the Samaritan says will happen, and he takes the injured man in. So love doesn't see a stranger. Love shows up even when it has to be vulnerable. And love shows up with no worries about image. Jesus was never afraid. This is one of my favorite phrases from last night. Jesus was never afraid of guilt by association. Never, right? He is always showing up with the people he wasn't supposed to be hanging around with, right? Like he gets accused. You eat with sinners, Like Jesus is always showing up. He's not concerned that somehow his image is going to be ruined by showing up with the wrong people, right? He's always showing up with them, and not only does he show up, but he calls them friend, beloved one. Even this lawyer who's being a little antagonistic towards Jesus, right? Trying to catch Jesus in some kind of religious slip-up, Jesus stays engaged with him. He keeps the conversation going. How can I stay connected 1 minute more? My friends, these are great lessons for us. Don't see a stranger. Show up, even when you have to be vulnerable. And don't worry about what other people are going to think if you show up to the wrong people. Because what if we chose to see each other and the world around us not as strangers, not as them, but sought to know and to listen and to understand? What if we chose to not see strangers or them, and we saw each other as someone needing a friend, a shoulder, an ear? What if we stopped assuming that I'm always right and actually listened to our neighbors? What if we stopped worrying about who's in and who's out and who's right and who's wrong and who deserves love and who doesn't. Because, my friends, if you are the one lying on the side of the road needing help, longing for support, someone to be with you, will you welcome whoever comes? Or when you see someone lying on the road, when you see someone who is broken and hurt, will you walk with them? Will you be love for them? Or will we let the divisions and the divides and the barriers that we set up have us walking on the other side of the road? It takes courage and vulnerability. Courage to step out, vulnerability to show up with love. To be who we really are with each other. To honor our differences. Whether we agree with each other or not, showing up. Do you know one of the biggest barriers, I think, in a community like ours is to vulnerability? The word fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. When you say hello to somebody, you say, hey, how are you? What do you expect? You expect people to say, I'm good, I'm fine. Or, the ultimate in vulnerability, I'm busy. Right? Like, have you ever said, how are you? And have somebody look at you and go, it's a really crappy day. Oh no. Now what do we do? Because they didn't give the right answer, right? When I first moved here to Faith, there were folks who were in leadership here who were working really hard to reestablish this community as a community of authenticity and vulnerability. And I'd been listening to and been taking part in, a number of things, and so I was kind of getting the lingo, and it was always said, like you speak if you're tired, if you're done, or if you're whatever, like just say that, right? So I find myself in a meeting, and we're talking through the strategy map, and we're trying to figure out the right words for the map to convey what we want this community to be about. We were sitting in what is now Ellen's office, around a table, and we were there for a couple of hours. And what I remember most about that day is I felt like I was mucking through weeds and mud, like trying to understand what was going on, trying to help get some right words. And at the end of the 2 hours, the person who was leading said, well, so where are we all at? Can we do a little more? Are we done for today? And the other people around the table are like, no, I can go for a little bit more. And inside I'm going, no, I can't even put a complete thought together anymore. And so I said, I can't. Like, this is language and stuff that you all know. And I feel like I'm mucking through the weeds and there's mud sucking at my feet. And I can't. I don't have any more in me today. And the response was, okay, we're done for today. Like who I was and where I was in that spot was honored. And I have never, will never forget that day. And the love that was shown to me as a leader showing up who had been taught never let them see you sweat, to learn the lesson that who I was honored, even when I wasn't at my best. Friends, it is easier, it is tidier, it is neater to declare me and them. Stranger, friend. It is messier and more faithful to see us. We are all travelers on the journey. Sometimes we're the robbers. Sometimes we're the robbed. Sometimes we're the ones who look away, and sometimes we're the ones who show up and stay. But following Jesus has never, ever been about neat and tidy. Ever. But rather, following Jesus has always been about being in this colorful, beautiful, messy middle of stranger and neighbor. Not either or, but both. And showing up for, or with love for us. This is a hard walk. This is hard work. And it calls us out of ourselves to think beyond what I like, what I want in the moment. It calls us to care more for the other person than in being right. But it is what Jesus calls us to be love for. And if we are questioning that, I'm going to close this morning's message with the words that Linda read for us from 1 John. Listen carefully. This is the message you have heard from the beginning. We should love one another. We know what real love is because Jesus gave up his life for us. We also ought to give up our lives for our brothers and sisters. If someone has enough money to live well and sees a brother or sister in need but shows no compassion, how can God's love be in that person? Dear children, dear friends, let us not merely say that we love each other, but let us show the truth by our actions. Welcome to the beautiful, messy middle called life with Jesus. Will you pray with me, please? Jesus, I have no idea who came to mind in each person's heart when I asked the question, who is the last person that you would want to have show up for you? But I pray for the relationship between those people, between our friends, between our neighbors, between us. I pray for the brokenness that causes us to think me versus them. I pray for the brokenness that has us walking on the other side of the road, shielding our eyes from them. I pray for hearts and lives that are so broken along the side of the road of this world. And I pray, Lord, that we will be people who show up for them, for us, for you. Pray this in your name and power, Jesus. Amen.